Welcome to Dwell on These Things, a podcast of Dwell Community Church in Columbus, Ohio, where we discuss whatever is honorable, pure, lovely, commendable, excellent, and praiseworthy. All right. Well, it's Paul back here today to talk about missions at Dwell Community Church with Dave Glover here. And how do you pronounce that?
Gianfranco. You can call me Conco. That's what people call me.
Is that like your missions name?
I just couldn't pronounce my name as a toddler, so I just called myself Conco, and it stuck.
Cool. All right. I'm catching you guys between trips, Anna.
Yes, that's right. I just came from Togo a couple weeks ago and I'm leaving for Cambodia and Southeast Asia this Friday in a couple of days.
Busy.
Yeah, and I just got back from Ecuador yesterday afternoon. So,
did you guys know when you took this job that it would require travel?
Yes.
I was shocked.
Yeah. Yes. We can't work remotely.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
With some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Ecuador. What was going on there?
Yeah, so our Dwell team collaborates every year to put on a medical clinic that lasts about 4 full days. So we bring medical professionals into the country and medicine, and then we collaborate with the local church that takes care of helping people into the clinic, shares the gospel with them, prays for them, and they do crowd control, and together we sort of collaborate to put on this 4-day clinic. So we saw about 1,700 patients last week alone, and all the people who went through sort of that prayer booth where they sit one-on-one with someone in the local church. About 150 of those 1,700 came to know Christ personally.
Week? No way.
Yeah, so pretty cool. And then I stayed a few days later with a couple guys from the team and I conducted some trainings. We just sat down with the elders and top leaders of the local churches in this province that we're working with, and we just studied the Bible together. So it's really, really fun, really edifying, yeah.
The church there ends up following up with these 1,700 people.
That's right, yeah. So you get all their contacts, and they call them, they invite them to church. The whole clinic culminates in a big event on Thursday night at the end of the clinic where the gospel is shared to everyone in the community, and they're invited back to church. So
Praise God.
Yeah, really cool.
It's a great trip because it's got both folks here from Dwell and the local church, working collaboratively. Both parties are in together doing the work. And then to have people on the ground that can follow up is really awesome.
That sounds like more than the average missions trip as far as effectiveness there. And are you acclimating back to English then?
It was nice to speak in my mother language. Yeah, that's good.
I'll talk slowly today. So you said Southeast Asia, Dave, next. What can you tell us about your mission there?
Yeah, so the first leg of the trip is in Cambodia, and we have 3 partners there. So we're going to visit each of those partners and spend time with, there's actually several couples that we have sent from Dwell, spend time with them, and then meet some of the national workers that they're working with, and then talk about, next steps with their vision for the future, that kind of thing. And then after that, we'll go on to Southeast Asia and meet with our team there. We're going to do quite a bit of traveling as far as seeing some different ministries within Southeast Asia that our team is working with. So a lot of it is, catching up with our folks on the ground, hopefully being a source of encouragement, continuing to build a relationship with the national workers there, providing a word of encouragement to them as well. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's great. What's your guys' role in the missions department?
Well, I'm the division coordinator. I oversee the missions division, which also includes Harambe, so domestically there. So I'm involved in, strategic planning for the division, working with our partners and doing strategic planning with them, some training, pastoral care. It kind of encompasses my role.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I have a dual position. One aspect of my job is the global partnership and developer role, where I've been assigned a couple of our partners to more directly engage with and do what Dave was sharing there with training and communicating with missionaries and talking and taking trips. But I'm also a logistics administrator, so I work with our reporting and some of our paperwork and put that together.
With all the teams, it sounds like there's plenty of that.
Yeah.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
Lots to keep track of.
You hear a lot about people feeling called to missions. Dave, I know you were previously superintendent of our schools and then took this job as missions director. Did you both feel particularly called towards missions?
Yeah, I can give you a little bit of background on that because I did serve at the schools from 1994 to 2010. In 2002, the elders asked me to consider leading the missions division. So it was something that my wife and I prayed about, and I decided to jump at the chance. And so it overlapped a bit. I was doing overseeing the schools and missions for about 8 years, and then in 2010 decided to go full-time into missions. But just looking at the history where I came from, this goes way back, but when I was younger, my parents, we would go every summer. Once I was about 10 or so years old, we would go out to the Southwest and work among Native American communities.
So you grew up following?
Yeah. In the 60s, my grandfather was real involved in work that was going on in Haiti at the time. So it was kind of a thing where our family was interested in cross-cultural ministry. We were exposed to that when I was pretty young. After I got married and such, Tracy and I went on, I think it was maybe one of the very first short-term trips to Brazil. We had a team in Brazil, and that really piqued our interest in missions. That would have been probably in the late 80s. And then in the late 90s, I went to Southeast Asia on behalf of the elders to help with some planning and, helping to assess the ministry there. Worked, real closely with Kurt and Pam Stearns, which was awesome. And, just came back from that even, more excited about what God was doing around the world. So there wasn't any one thing, but it was a series of events and experiences that really piqued my interest in missions, serving the poor. So when, I was asked to consider the missions role, it really was kind of a no-brainer for me.
Sounds like God did a lot to prepare you for that role too.
Yeah.
Even as a child.
Yeah,
It's neat.
I agree.
I am comparatively newer to this. I grew up in Chile, in South America, and came to the United States when I was 18. Growing up in a place that, in very recent memory, up until the 90s, my home country was considered a missions field.
Really?
But growing up there in the 90s and the 2000s, very quickly, we started viewing ourselves as a Latin American church as a missionary force. No longer a place that needed Westerners to come and teach us, but rather to be ourselves the ones who are going and start in places where Christ has not been heard. So I actually gave my life to Christ at a missions conference in South America when I was 15, after hearing testimonies from people who were serving overseas, but had come from Latin America, and just even hearing about the need where there's areas of the world where people have never heard even the name Jesus Christ, and I've never heard the message of salvation, and just feeling really burdened to participate, not just in that, but also in poverty alleviation. You hear about the suffering that people are going through in different places. So anyways, that's kind of how I got my life with Christ started. I was already a believer, but I truly was won over by the cause of missions. So
It's cool, man. And now getting to go on trips like to Ecuador and continuing what you learned as a kid, what you were passionate about.
Yeah, and it's also, I'm one of them, I'm a peer.
Well, it's cool, guys. Did want to talk about our missions department. A lot of exciting things going on, it seems. My impression is that the work being done in missions through this church, it's not a side ministry, but a huge operation and investment. Could you guys give us a snapshot of just the scope of the work being done, kind of big picture?
Yeah, we'll try and summarize here. It is pretty amazing to see what the Lord's done over the last several years. But so right now we have 13 commissioned missionaries. We have about 380 church planters that we support, indigenous people that are working, in some cases alongside our missionaries that we've sent. In other cases, it's actual partnerships that we have. And in addition to that, we have some partners, especially in West Africa. We have two partners, Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. And not only are they planting churches within their own countries, but we're seeing that expand throughout the West Africa region to now where there's house churches in 6 to 8 other countries in West Africa. In the network of our partners, there's about 35,000 people that are in attendance weekly, coming out to home churches. We, as a church, again, just incredibly grateful for the generosity of our church, but we give just over $2 million a year to missions efforts, and that would include supporting missionaries, our Global Partnership Fund, what we have in the general fund, that kind of thing. That ends up being just over 25% of our overall receipts that come into Dwell. So it's a big
Are
percentage.
going out to these external ministries.
Yes.
That's a significant amount.
Yeah.
As you've looked at other churches, is that number comparable or?
From what I understand, it far exceeds what many other churches do. So,
Yeah, 25%.
mm-hmm.
But you're talking, you said 38,000?
Yeah, right now there's about 35,000 people.
35,000 people affected. That's 7 or 8 times the number of people involved in our ministry here.
Yeah, we're just incredibly grateful for the people that we have on the ground, the people that we've sent, and, the indigenous partners that God's led us to who are...
About 400 there, you said, right?
Yeah, 380, so, yeah.
It's been a process of our church developing its missionary impact. At one point, it seemed like what our church was mainly involved in were sending out teams to plant churches in other countries. There was also supplemental missions trips that people could go on there. And then at some point, the introduction of the Humanitarian Aid and Development Fund came along, and then Global Partners more recently. Could you guys explain how those got going?
Yeah. I'll try and make it relatively short. It is interesting because we did start off sending. We sent people quite aggressively initially. And we were exclusively at the time and continue to work among the least reached and the poor. And so our missionaries were on the ground doing some pioneer work in many cases, initially, discipling, trying to reach out to people, trying to raise up leaders. What we found, too, again, is because we're working among the poor, there was really a need to meet some of the physical needs the people that they were working with had. And so really, in 2004, the Humanitarian Aid Fund came out of that, where we supported our missionaries on the ground, and then they would identify different needs, and it could be, a wide variety of community development needs. And that kind of over time evolved into actually supporting some national workers and church planters to help, supplement their salaries. So initially, the Humanitarian Aid Fund was primarily global in nature. We did support ministries and still do, Youth for Christ, Harambe, other local ministries. But initially, that's the way the Humanitarian Aid Fund was. And then it kind of morphed into the Global Partnership Fund. So the Global Partnership Fund was designed to allow us to continue to grow and expand missions, for people that were burdened to see world missions expand, that they could provide support there. So the humanitarian aid became mostly domestic in nature. There are some foreign funds that are in there. But the Global Partnership Fund became focused on, we want to do church planting, raising up indigenous leaders to lead the ministries, and facilitating that work. And so the money in the Global Partnership Fund is going to our global partners who are doing church planting. It's providing support for, I mentioned the 380 workers. It provides, partial support for them. But that's kind of the Global Partnership Fund is channeled in that direction. So it's kind of as our missions program has developed, the Global Partnership Fund came out of that.
Seems like there's an efficiency there. How much would it cost to send 380 missionaries from here to?
Yeah, and on a very, pragmatic level, there's that. To be fair, there's many of the indigenous workers that we're supporting that we would have not known if we hadn't had missionaries on the ground. So there is that. I think the other thing that you see with supporting indigenous work, and this is what Paul Borthwick and other missiologists call the era 4 of missions, where we are looking to facilitate our national partners. As God uses the body of Christ, what can we bring to the table? And what do they as national workers bring? And so God uses the global body of Christ to really see his kingdom expand. And so when you think about an indigenous person, they understand the language, they understand the culture, they understand the worldview, maybe the religious background that most people are coming from, which is something that,
which may take an American missionary 10 years to get, if that.
Then even, at least in my experience, as we go and meet people from other cultures, you can understand what they're saying, but you realize there's really something I will never plumb the depths of, And so, from a purely strategic standpoint, if you can get a person sharing Christ, discipling someone in their own language and culture, it's going to be more effective. On our side, we have decades of house church planning experience here, incredible equipping program, student ministries. Those are all things that we can share and collaborate with our national partners.
I would add to that this sort of evolution into a global partnership program is really a maturation of our missions thinking and an adjustment to realities that we're seeing in the missions field. This focus that instead of us being the ones that are doing everything and starting from the ground up, but rather we're partnering, we're finding local bodies of believers that are passionate, enthusiastic, but just simply need some equipping or some assistance and partnering with them as equals. And really, honestly, we are under their direction. We're serving them. And so to fit our global workers, right, our commissioned missionaries, our Western workers into that paradigm is really, I think, one of the greatest values of this partnership, that it's Western boots on the ground, it's Western donors and churches linking up local bodies of believers that are reaching out into their own communities and forming self-sustaining, self-propagating, self-governing churches that are reaching their own communities. I think it's just it's a beautiful expression of how the body of Christ really works on a global level.
And that it's not an American or Western thing.
Right.
This really goes against some typical stereotypes of missions.
That's right.
The Western Christian coming into a culture and telling them what to believe.
And there's a place for everyone, too, in that. Yeah.
But I imagine, too, one of the sacrifices is the amount of oversight or quality control.
There's certainly a sense that each of these ministries has been carefully vetted from the very beginning of the partnership. So we don't just pop in and pick a random person off the street and say, here you go, here's some money, right? There's a sense that we're forming relationships over a long period of time.
You trust and know the leaders of these.
Yeah. And there's several of us that are working to oversee these partnerships because, it would be an impossible task for one or two people to do. So we share that responsibility. But Kanko alluded to the vetting process, which we've learned a lot over the last several years. It typically takes 2 to 3 years before we actually will engage with finances or training or that kind of thing. But, we want to make sure that we know the partner well. And then we want to try and ease into those partnerships. Yeah, we make mistakes, but I think we've learned from that. And with each passing year, I think we get a little bit better at our vetting. What's accountability look like in those situations? And that accountability goes both ways. Are we here in Columbus going to be able to deliver on what we say we're going to do and vice versa? So the relationships are complicated. And it takes really a team to be looking at each partnership and really determining how do we go forward, what do we need to change, how do we get better.
It's a partnership. It's not we're over you guys telling you what to do.
That's right.
We're feeling out this relationship. Do we share enough values? Do they want the feedback or training or the things that we can provide?
Right. Yeah, I would say most of our partners, we don't have someone from Dwell on the ground there with them. And so we don't want to be in a place where we're dictating what you do with how you spend your time and that kind of thing. What we do want to agree on is the values that we're going to be all about: evangelism, discipleship, training, equipping, and then planting house churches. And obviously there's, doctrinal pieces that we need to be on the same page, but we don't want to get in and micromanage what these different ministries are doing on a day-to-day basis.
Well, with over 30,000 people being affected by this, it sounds like this approach is working quite well. Mm-hmm. Is there a partner that stands out right now that you guys are excited about? What's going on that you could talk about?
There's a couple that are really fresh in my mind, in that coming back from Togo, seeing our two partners from Burkina Faso and one from Cote d'Ivoire who have a real vision for seeing all of West Africa reached. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one I'm very excited about, to see what God does there. It's not without some significant challenges. That's incredible to see what God's doing in that area.
You said it's spread to 7 countries around?
Yeah, there's between 6 to 8 different countries now. One thing with Sub-Sahel West Africa is there's a lot of civil unrest. From the northern part, there's a rise in radical Islam, and it's pushing its way south, and so people are being displaced. And so there's a unique opportunity and a window that we have to work where people are coming to faith, and the house church is not only, like we've seen here, the most effective way to grow a church, but in those settings, it might be the safest way also because of the persecution.
That's right.
So I think, we're very excited about what's going on in West Africa. I think what we have in Asia, like I had mentioned, going to Cambodia and Southeast Asia, those works among those partners continue to grow. And we're seeing really strong leaders raised up that hopefully at some point we're going to be able to pass the baton and say, okay, this is completely yours, and we'll go on to something else, whatever the Lord has.
Is that the goal of each of these, to be completely self?
The goal would be that, let me take a step back. I think that because of the context in which we're working that are extremely poor, I believe there's always going to be a need for some financial assistance. So to be completely sustainable in, a country where the average person is getting $1 or $2 a day, probably not going to happen. We do want to see them as in the local church to be able to continue to give and maybe provide support for the church planter. And we're seeing that take place in some of our contexts. But I guess to answer your question, at some point, that would be the ideal, that a Western missionary would be able to step back, turn this over to a national leader and say, okay, we trust you. Yeah. You've got the necessary training. You've got the burden, the passion.
And the resources.
This is your ministry. So,
do you have a ministry to beat that one?
I don't, but I would add, I think we're on a regular basis pretty blown away by the sacrifice that people display and just some of the working conditions, living conditions that these people are in. Obviously, our Western global workers have given a whole life away for the sake of the gospel, and we're very, very impressed and blown away by that, but also our indigenous workers or the members of these house churches who are on a regular basis working under the strain of poverty, of emergency persecution, civil unrest. And in many cases, we get reports, for example, in India where people are getting beat up by extreme Hindu mobs and some people are being jailed, killed. And, so we're sitting here and we're just like, I can't believe that we get to partner with people whose faith just far exceeds mine. I think that when we're in heaven, we're going to be cleaning some of these people's toilets. So
maybe they'll partner with you.
That's right. That's right.
It's very humbling when you meet people that are, so sold out to Christ that they're sacrificing on a level that we will likely not know here in the U.S.
Clive Calver was saying something similar, that we have so much to learn from the second and third world church through their faith.
The way they pray, the faith that they have that God's going to work and come through is incredible.
And so what a blessing you guys get to see it firsthand and hear these stories. I thought it'd be cool to have you guys share some of that, and we are, and this is good. It does bring up a question. With all these exciting things going on with our global partners, are we still dedicated to sending missionaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, we're still dedicated to sending missionaries. And matter of fact, over the last decade, we've sent 8 different couples. And, pretty close to a couple a year over the last decade.
Yeah,
so
I had no idea. That's great.
I think we're definitely still a sending church. All of the missionaries that we've sent are working among unreached people groups, too. So that's a high priority for us. One other thing that's unique, and which really I think makes us a sending church, is that any missionary that we send overseas, 80% of their funding comes with Inside Dwell, which is highly unusual compared to other churches. Most other missionaries have to go outside their own home church and look for sources of income outside their church.
And 80%, is that, how much is that from the budget or from people?
Good question. There's 10% that comes from our general fund for every one of our commissioned missionaries. And there's 70% that they are free to raise with Inside Dwell. So again, that's highly unusual compared to other churches.
A large percentage of
Right.
these. Cool. How many sent missionaries do we have on the field?
We have 13 sent that are commissioned missionaries that are working with our global partners. And then we also have another 10 strategic partners that are working in unreached people groups as well. So 23 missionaries currently on the field. One of our commissioned missionaries that I think I should mention that's somewhat unique, Lou and Gennett, who are working in Ethiopia. This was an opportunity where we had somebody that was attending Dwell. Lou had started a church as a young man in Ethiopia. He came here for college, got connected to Dwell, and so he underwent several years of training here, both in some coursework. He met with the missions division for a few years, and he and his wife Gennett really had a burden to return to Ethiopia, to the church that they had started. And so now Lou and Gennett have gone back and are leading a network of house churches among the Amharic and Tigray people.
That we've heard so much about in the news.
Right. Yes. And by the way, that they just had a peace agreement
Praise
that was
God.
reached. So that's really good news for Lou and his team there. So there could be other people like Lou and Gennett in our midst that possibly could return to their home country.
That have the language, the background, and a
Right.
culture.
Yeah. And
Then
then
be
they
trained to lead home churches and start a movement elsewhere.
Yeah. So we're open to a wide variety of possibilities,
Great.
which includes sending.
We want to send, but we want to send well. We want to send strategically, and we want to be somewhat selective in our sending process.
Cool. So if someone's listening in and maybe they feel called to be involved in missions, a burden for the world, where would you guys point them?
One of the first things I would encourage is we do a quarterly missions night that we work through each of our partners. I think if you're just really investigating, trying to understand what God is doing through Dwell and the missions, that would be a starting point because you can come and hear how God's working among our partners. I think you can, receive our prayer letters would be another thing that gives you a pretty good exposure to what's happening on the field. It introduces you to some of the names of the people that we're working with, some of our missionaries that we've sent. We're going to continue to do short-term trips. That would be another means for actually, getting on the ground and meeting people face to face, seeing what it's like to live in their context. So
And that was probably postponed during COVID.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
But we're getting those back going again.
That's right.
that's the hope in 2023 that we would. Well, and then, of course, the one in Ecuador we were able to do because some of the COVID restrictions had been lifted.
Was this the first one since pandemic?
Yeah. I would add too, Paul, that if someone feels a burning desire to go and sort of live somewhere else for the sake of the gospel, I would really, really encourage those people to first do the work here. I think a lot of people are afraid to invest and chip in on what Dwell and our local church is doing for fear that sort of being invested here will prevent opportunities elsewhere. And I actually think that the people we would be most excited to send somewhere are the people who have a long track record of house church planting, of raising up disciples into leadership, of people who are well equipped, their marriages are strong, their inner life with God is vibrant, and you know what I mean. So there's kind of this sense that we first should try to have success in the context God has placed us in, to really serve Him faithfully here before we're even considering going somewhere else. So.
Mature and learn to shepherd and disciple and lead.
Right. Identify your giftings too, to figure out what that God has uniquely given you to do. So.
Good.
Yeah, I think there's many opportunities here within Columbus even to work cross-culturally that would be, some good experience as well. If someone believes, they're being called to some type of international work, there's lots that can be done here as well. And you can kind of get a feel for what would it look like, to work cross-culturally. So
People wanted more information on that. Where would they?
they could email
missionsadmin@dwellcc.org.
Or Dave Glover at. Just kidding.
That's right. At AOL.com.
614.
And dwellcc.org/missions.
Yeah.
The next few years, do you guys envision expansion of our fields? Do you have any sense yet for where God might be taking us?
It's always the first order of business is to make sure that our general fund here is funded. Because, there's a large amount of money that comes from the general fund that supports our global partners as well. And not to mention all the other incredible ministry that gets done here in Columbus. So I think that's first and foremost. I think within the next several years, it will be interesting to see what unfolds in Africa, as well as in Asia, too, in the countries we're working in. But there could be opportunities for expansion there. But that's something we're just kind of watching very closely to see what the needs might be.
Well, guys, very encouraging stuff. Grateful for you both sharing with us today about some of the cool stuff going on in missions at Dwell and for managing such a worthwhile ministry. Grateful, too, to our missionaries and the partners we have around the globe, on the ground, extending God's love to those in real need. May God continue to encourage and empower you to press on. And as mentioned, if you're listening in and interested in learning more about missions field and partnerships at Dwell Community Church, dwellcc.org/missions.
Yeah.
And if you like these podcasts and you'd like alerts about future episodes, press the subscribe or the follow button. Until then, press on.